What I want to put forward is what I think is a simple and workable idea on how we can fix the problem about the horse race numbers and how we can transcend it and ultimately have better discussions, how we can create discussions and conversations that ultimately help to reinforce the appropriate use of research, including polling. So we have discussed the problems. Yeah, that when polling gets represented, it often comes out, it receives a fair amount of attention. And you can be sure that people will walk home after having read a relatively long and nuanced article, and they will take 2 or 3 pieces of information out of that, of what they have read. They'll take out the horse race numbers. Like sugary drinks, these numbers are very, very sticky, and they're also not particularly good for you or for the people that consume them in large numbers. But it's natural that they attract this level of attention. And this ultimately, at best, as we discussed, is a distraction. At worst, it ends up being destructive to the kinds of concerns we have that you mentioned, and I think that turned up in what you said about media discussion, and again, Iago, you had highlighted these things, or on how politicians consume that. So why is that a problem? Well, the single numbers are misleading, and they will be misleading for the reasons that were discussed, as you had talked about the shy voters in the context of Tories and the famous John Major victory in 1992. We'll have a remaining issue with the undecideds. We don't know who's going to turn out, and this will systematically, it's unlikely that this is going to be possible to solve this in Georgia. We had this discussion about a year ago where we talked about these issues, and then some people said, well, this is always going to happen. The media demand is going to be there for something that is going to be prediction. And we, as with sugary drinks, we can say, please don't consume them, but the demand likely is going to be there. So we need to find better ways of discussing these issues, because the demand for prediction, I think, much as I would hope to transcend it, is still going to be there, and it's also going to be reasonably there for a good number of reasons. Because, for example, smaller parties will want to understand what their electoral prospects are in terms of potentially going in for coalitions. So what happens? If you think about it very quickly, there are 3 ways in which people establish, only really 3 ways in which we establish what truth is. It's either that everybody has a consensus on it, the scientific community. It's that it's internally coherent, or that it corresponds to observable phenomena. Now, in this way, if you have numbers in your mind, 19 and 14, or the famous numbers that Alassania had before the mayoral race, and you afterwards compared, it doesn't correspond. And in scientific terms, this is falsified. In Popperian terms, and Karl Popper's terms, it's a clear disproving of the methodology, the sociological methodology you have, because that's the kind of contrast you set up. And what then happens is that all the other information that the research can offer, potentially on how to save lives in the hundreds of people that get killed on Georgian roads, or about the quality of the air that many parents in Tbilisi are concerned about, all of this other information gets drowned out because you believe that you're looking at an unreliable tool. So what's an alternative? And it's one we tested as a pilot. You know, we're only gathering experience with it. We tested at relatively low costs. It's actually to move away from the single fixed number that people look at and will remember, and to talk about a corridor of expectation, about a kind of an upper and lower boundary, or if you want to think it not in the kind of vertical way, a kind of a runway that you're likely to be on. And you do the following. You aggregate the estimates by engaged observers, and you try and recruit quite widely. There's a precedent for that. If you want to read the book, Wisdom of Crowds, sure, it takes the argument to an extreme, but points out that systematically, often when you aggregate estimates, you get better results than for kind of single estimates. That's not great for a particular category of event, but we can discuss this later. But generally, it's quite a good result. If I had a box here, I've often done this. If I had a glass full of M&Ms, and I asked all of you to estimate how many M&Ms were in there, the likelihood that the final result is going to be quite close is good. Yeah, you can test this in all sorts of contexts. So that's what we did. We recruited about 30 engaged observers. Not all of them needed to be experts. And we gave each of them an opportunity to answer what they thought the upper and lower, the actual number was going to be, what the actual number was going to be, what they thought what this was going to be. You clean the data. In this case, we hadn't even recruited them in a very tight way. We had a kind of very open call for this. And then you look where most of the expectation falls. This is something I ended up doing with Corneli and his Kakachia and his colleagues. Then we kind of formalized that. We had run a couple of versions of this kind of entirely spontaneously, just in a network of people. But now you find that on the GIP expert polls website. So there's a bit of a home for this pilot. And again, it's a pilot. We haven't really drawn there very much on what others have done. And now let's look here. Next slide, please. At the results. So this was done about 2 weeks, a bit more than 2 weeks before the parliamentary election. And we tried to, and we put people, we kind of mapped where 75% of the estimates were. In other words, if you will, we lopped off estimates on either side. I'm not saying this is the perfect method of doing it, but you can, if you want to, you can draw down the data and play with it as well. That's part of the very idea of the transparency. And now look at the results. So the Georgian Dream, the upper boundary, the actual result was above the upper boundary. Here, interesting result from the pilot. I cleaned the data. There was one estimate in there. There were 1 or 2 estimates in there. One estimate that said 75%. I thought, that's totally crazy. That has to be a troll. I took it out. Most likely, that would have shifted a little bit upward if I hadn't done excessive cleaning. So that's an important and interesting lesson from that as well. But take a look at the United National Movement and the midpoint of the United National Movement. This exercise, in principle, except for the staff time, cost almost nothing at all. Compare that to the exit polls that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and were actually, in some cases, further, certainly not as close as the midpoint of the UNM estimate was to the eventual result. The Burcholadze party imploded just right about at that point, 2 weeks, so that's not something one can actually predict. But with the others, I think it highlights that all of them were very close to what ended up being the result, that they were under the 5% threshold. Now, my argument for this is not only that it yields what I think are fairly solid results that you can think about, and of course it doesn't give you the point landing, but it gives you, I think it gives you a fairly plausible corridor. The points it does is that it changes the way we talk about it. It highlights the uncertainty that's implicit in this kind of exercise. People talk about a range. It builds on actual polls. So I should be very clear, this never replaces the polls, because the information that people draw is based on those polls, and it allows for a conversation. I think people are right to be skeptical of all polling, because polling is a claim to huge legitimacy. You stand up in front of an audience and you say, behind me is the aggregate thinking of an entire nation, and any sane person would be skeptical of this. The problem we have in the way that we represent it right now is that these things are presented as final certainties when, for the methodological reasons that I mentioned earlier, we can't have that certainty. Next slide. And I think by showing these corridors of expectation, you share the conversation. You say, you out there, you can also have a position on how you interpret raw numbers in terms of what it means for the final results. So rather than a claim for top-down authority, it says, here's a basis of what we think may happen. What do you actually estimate comes out of that? If you want people to think in terms of probabilities, and that's what science does in prediction, if you want people to think in terms of probabilities, you shouldn't use the language of certainty. And a single number on that is certainty. Or let me put it more positively, you should make it possible for people to express themselves that make it possible precisely to talk about what do I think, what is my view. And I think thereby it does a service not only to the particular polls, it also does a service to how people think about data and how they think about the use of evidence and how they think about their own position, that they're not a congregation that sits somewhere and that is being kind of lectured on that, but that ultimately on all data, interpretation and conversation and discussion, what do we make of it, is key for it to be used appropriately in a democracy.